Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to the Sanctuary. I'm your host, Professor C, and today we're going to continue our series on A and P. Specifically, today we're going to look at the synovial joints, all 6 types, with some examples. So let's jump into it. Okay, in our last discussion, we mentioned the 3 types of fibrous joints, all of which are synarthrotic or not movable. We also mentioned the cartilaginous joints, the 2 types, which are sort of movable. They're amphiarthrotic. In today's lecture, we're going to hit the 6 types of synovial joints that are all considered to be diarthrotic joints, are freely movable joints, and we'll look at a couple of examples of each one. These are the 6 major classes. I'm just going to read them out to you so you hear me pronounce them. Pivot, ball and socket, hinge, gliding, saddle or sellar. If you can remember the sella turcica from the sphenoid bone, it meant Turkish saddle, so sellar or saddle joint, and a condyloid joint, also known as an ovoid joint. Now, synovial joints are different from the other 2 classes, the fibrous and the cartilaginous, in that some of them contain BURSAE. Now, the details of the image are irrelevant here for us right now, but I'm going to circle here in this shoulder image all of these bluish sacs of fluid, and I can go over here on the other side to where the hip is, and I can just put a circle around these sacs here. So BURSAE, one singular one would be called a bursa, is a sac of synovial fluid. And again, we only find these in synovial joints, so not all of them, just some of them have these bursae. So it's filled with synovial fluid, and it acts as a lubricant to reduce friction, not only between the bony parts of the joint, but it could also be in between the bone and corresponding ligaments or tendon sheaths or any other thing that's wrapping around that particular joint. First type of synovial joint is the pivot. And right here I'm putting a check is a nice little artist rendition of what that would look like. And you can almost picture that in your mind here. So this, of course, is the big H for humerus. We have the ulna here, and we have the radius. So what I'm really focused on is this annular ligament that's holding the radius to the ulna on the kind of the outside of the head of the radius. So this is the classic example of a pivot joint, and it allows you to basically pronate and supinate your palm, which means turn palms up and palms down, by radiating the radius over the ulna. So that's referred to as, very simply, a proximal radio-ulnar joint. On the right side of the screen, we have, it looks like to me, 2 cervical vertebrae, and this would be C1. And I'm drawing the C1 on the actual facets that would, where the occipital condyles would sit down from the occipital bone. So the skull would sit on top of that. And then here, where I'm putting a D, that's the dens of C2, and I see C2 there. It's got a really nice bifid spinous process in that image. But this is the joint that connects the C1 to C2, or the atlas to the axis. So it has this name, atlantoaxial joint. And of course, this allows you to pivot your head from side to side, do medial and lateral rotation of the head. Ball and socket joint is very similar to a trailer hitch, where you have a ball that fits into a socket, and that's how it gets the name, very simply. The classic examples here where the arm bone, the humerus, meets up with the scapula, and over here you see where the femur is meeting up with the innominate bone, or the pelvis, on either side. So we can talk about a glenohumeral joint, right? The humerus fitting into the glenoid cavity. And on the other side, we can call that an acetabulofemoral joint. The acetabulum being the bowl on the pelvic bones, and the femur being the leg bone, or the thigh bone, we should say, to be correct. Okay, a hinge joint is something we've seen in another image, but just to reiterate, there's an ulna. I don't need the radius this time. I don't need to talk about its partner, but I see that trochlear notch of the ulna that's going to bite onto the trochlea of the humerus here. So what we're seeing is the elbow joint, and it's a classic example of the hinge joint. Now, over on the left-hand side of the screen, you kind of see a mechanic's view of what that would look like. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of terms. if you're taking one of the bones, like the ulna here, let's pretend that's the ulna and this is the humerus right here, and you're decreasing the angle between those two bones, right? You're decreasing the angle. That is called a flexion. So when you hear somebody talk about making a flexion, or the action of flexing something, it's not what we think about making a muscle bulge out. In this case, a flexion is a reduction of an angle, reducing an angle between two bones. If you were to increase the angle between two bones, that is to do this on the bottom here, this is called an extension. An extension. So to extend your elbow would be this motion. To flex the elbow or flex forearm would be the other motion. Okay, it's very similar to the way that a laptop top would fold down on top of the keyboard and then be moved up, very much like it folds on its double hinges. So the elbow is a classic example, and the humero-ulnar joint is the one that I'm talking about specifically here. Now the next section is on gliding joints, and there aren't too many good examples of these, but you can see in this picture it kind of looks like two wooden pegs sliding along at least two axes here, kind of a biaxial motion. So the very classic example, the only one that comes to my mind immediately, is an intercarpal joint. Again, remember, inter meaning in between, and a carpal referring to the wrist bones. So I'm not going to draw this precisely, but just imagine in here, in between these carpal bones are specific types of gliding joints that allow those carpals to glide and slide over each other. Think about using a mouse with your computer, for instance, and you have to move your wrist back and forth, slide it along the table, and do a gliding motion. So these are gliding synovial joints. Saddle joints are sellar joints, and if you look down here, it's a very nice image of that. It almost looks like, again, a cowboy sitting in the saddle on a horse, right? The only example that usually shows up in any textbook is where we have the trapezium bone. I'm way over here on the right side. The trapezium, one of the carpal bones, meeting up with the metacarpal of the thumb, or the metacarpal of digit 1. And you can almost see the details there. It very much looks like this picture over here, where we have one of them kind of domed out, and we have the other one kind of sunken in, one convex and one concave, and they can slide around each other, but not quite the same way that the gliding joint did. So this is a saddle, also known as a sellar joint with an S, and the trapezio-metacarpal joint is the perfect, sometimes the only example you see of this on lectures. It lets us do this, basically. It lets us have what we call an opposable thumb, which, again, why it's so important for humans to have this. It lets us grab on to something, not only, say, of branches as we're climbing trees, but it lets us to use tools very specifically throughout our evolutionary history. Condyloid, or ovoid joints here, are kind of like that, and it's hard to describe this for me using mechanical terms, but I think the image kind of tells us how this will move. The only example that comes to my mind is called a radiocarpal joint. So if we have a radius here, again, using the wrist as an example, I could draw a squiggle of red right in here, where we have the scaphoid and lunate bones, the two carpal bones there, meet up with the radius. So there's the radiocarpal joint, an example of a condyloid or an ovoid joint. All right, if you enjoyed that one, there's one more joint video I'm going to have next. You can check it out. It's on specifically on the knee joint. So I'll see you when we get there. Bye-bye.